My name is Pedro, and I'm 37 years old. I never thought I'd find myself sitting in a hushed lawyer's office, the air thick with unspoken resentment and the heavy scent of old paper and polished wood, anticipating the final words of my own father. It felt surreal, like a scene pulled from a forgotten movie, but the cold leather beneath my palms was undeniably real. Today was the day his will would be read, and frankly, my sister Sofia was barely containing her smirk. She always believed she was Dad's favorite, and that everything would naturally fall into her lap. The tension in the room was a tangible, almost suffocating thing. Sofia sat opposite me, her expensive silk dress rustling subtly as she shifted, a calculating glint in her eyes. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair seemed to shimmer under the soft office lighting. She kept shooting quick, possessive glances at the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, as if to remind him who the true heir was. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of grief and detachment. My father, Marcus, had been a complex man, a real estate mogul who built an empire from nothing, but his personal life was often a labyrinth of secrets. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks ago, leaving a legacy as grand as it was mysterious. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Thank you for coming, Pedro and Sofia," he began, his voice calm and professional. Just as he was about to delve into the formal proceedings, the door to the waiting room creaked open. Everyone's heads snapped towards the sound. Standing tentatively in the doorway was Maria, our father's housekeeper for the past 20 years. She was a small woman, her uniform meticulously clean, her face etched with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much but said little. Her eyes, usually warm and deferential, now held a hint of uncertainty. Sofia's reaction was immediate and visceral. A sharp, derisive scoff escaped her lips, loud enough to cut through the silence. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth, not to muffle the sound, but almost to accentuate her disbelief. Her eyes narrowed into slits as she looked at Maria, then back at me, as if expecting me to share her outrage. "What in God's name is she doing here?" Sofia hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper that vibrated with disdain. Mr. Henderson merely offered Maria a small, reassuring nod, then gestured for her to enter. The unfolding events were already twisting in ways none of us could have predicted, a subtle shift in the air promising a monumental unveiling. Sofia continued to glare, her features tightening as Maria found a chair quietly in the corner, her presence a stark, unexpected anomaly. This unassuming woman was now undeniably part of our father's final act, and the tension ratcheted up another notch, signaling that comfortable assumptions were about to be severely challenged. My name is Pedro, and I'm 37 years old. I never thought I'd find myself sitting in a hushed lawyer's office, the air thick with unspoken resentment and the heavy scent of old paper and polished wood, anticipating the final words of my own father. It felt surreal, like a scene pulled from a forgotten movie, but the cold leather beneath my palms was undeniably real. Today was the day his will would be read, and frankly, my sister, Sofia, was barely containing her smirk. She always believed she was Dad's favorite, and that everything would naturally fall into her lap. The tension in the room was a tangible, almost suffocating thing. Sofia sat opposite me, her expensive silk dress rustling subtly as she shifted, a calculating glint in her eyes. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair seemed to shimmer under the soft office lighting. She kept shooting quick, possessive glances at the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, as if to remind him who the true heir was. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of grief and detachment. My father, Marcus, had been a complex man, a real estate mogul who built an empire from nothing, but his personal life was often a labyrinth of secrets. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks ago, leaving a legacy as grand as it was mysterious. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Thank you for coming, Pedro and Sofia," he began, his voice calm and professional. Just as he was about to delve into the formal proceedings, the door to the waiting room creaked open. Everyone's heads snapped towards the sound. Standing tentatively in the doorway was Maria, our father's housekeeper for the past 20 years. She was a small woman, her uniform meticulously clean, her face etched with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much but said little. Her eyes, usually warm and deferential, now held a hint of uncertainty. Sofia's reaction was immediate and visceral. A sharp, derisive scoff escaped her lips, loud enough to cut through the silence. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth, not to muffle the sound, but almost to accentuate her disbelief. Her eyes narrowed into slits as she looked at Maria, then back at me, as if expecting me to share her outrage. "What in God's name is she doing here?" Sofia hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper that vibrated with disdain. Mr. Henderson merely offered Maria a small, reassuring nod, then gestured for her to enter. The unfolding events were already twisting in ways none of us could have predicted, a subtle shift in the air promising a monumental unveiling. Sofia continued to glare, her features tightening as Maria found a chair quietly in the corner, her presence a stark, unexpected anomaly. This unassuming woman was now undeniably part of our father's final act, and the tension ratcheted up another notch, signaling that comfortable assumptions were about to be severely challenged. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again, his gaze calm as it swept over us, lingering for a moment on Sofia's indignant face, then settling on Maria. "Maria is here at Mr. Marcus's express request," he stated, his voice unwavering. "As a beneficiary." Sofia practically exploded. Her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor as she half rose, her face a mask of incredulity and fury. "A beneficiary? Are you quite mad, Mr. Henderson? She's the housekeeper. She cleans the toilets, for heaven's sake. What possible claim could she have on my father's estate?" Her words, though hissed, carried enough venom to curdle milk. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for an alliance I wasn't prepared to offer. I remained silent, a knot tightening in my stomach. Dad always had a flair for the dramatic, but this felt like a deliberate, calculated move. Maria, meanwhile, sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap. She didn't flinch, didn't meet Sofia's enraged gaze. Her quiet composure, in stark contrast to Sofia's histrionics, was almost unnerving. It was as if she had anticipated this reaction, or perhaps simply resigned herself to it long ago. I found myself studying her, a woman who had been a silent fixture in our lives, observing everything from the periphery. What secrets did she hold? What understanding did she share with my father that Sofia and I clearly lacked? "With all due respect, Sofia," Mr. Henderson interjected, his tone firm. Mr. Marcus had every right to include anyone he wished in his will. His instructions were clear and legally sound. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Now, if we could proceed without further interruption." His gaze was pointed, making it clear this was not a debate. Sofia slumped back into her chair, a simmering rage etched on her features, her chest heaving slightly. She muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like absurd and disgraceful, but she held her tongue, at least for the moment. The air in the room, already heavy, now crackled with an undeniable sense of impending revelation, a storm brewing just beneath the surface of the lawyer's calm demeanor. Mr. Henderson adjusted his spectacles once more, his fingers tracing the edges of the thick legal document resting on the polished mahogany desk. The quiet rustle of paper was the only sound for a long moment, amplifying the strained silence. "Very well," he began, his voice cutting through the tension. "Let us proceed with the last will and testament of Marcus Thorne." He cleared his throat and started to read, his words formal and precise, detailing initial bequests to various charities our father had supported over the years. A wildlife conservancy, a local art fund, even a scholarship in his mother's name. Sofia shifted impatiently, a barely perceptible tapping of her foot against the floor, clearly uninterested in these philanthropic gestures. Her gaze kept darting from Mr. Henderson to the stack of papers, her hunger for what she believed was rightfully hers almost palpable. "To my son, Pedro Thorne," Mr. Henderson continued, his eyes briefly meeting mine, "I bequeath my collection of vintage vinyl records and the classic 1968 Mustang I painstakingly restored with him." A small, bittersweet smile touched my lips. The Mustang. That car represented countless weekends spent in the garage with Dad, our hands greasy, our conversations surprisingly open. It was a tangible piece of our shared history, a memory worth more than any monetary value. Sofia scoffed, a soft, dismissive sound that conveyed her opinion on such sentimental trivialities. Records and an old car? Really, Dad? He always was a romantic, she murmured, loud enough for me to hear, her tone dripping with thinly veiled scorn. Then came Sofia's turn. To my daughter, Sofia Thorne, I leave my extensive art collection, currently housed in the Fifth Avenue Gallery space, valued at approximately $4 million, along with the Thorne Corporation shares amounting to a majority stake in its most recent ventures. A triumphant smirk finally bloomed across Sofia's face, her earlier indignation momentarily forgotten. She leaned back, a satisfied sigh escaping her lips, her eyes gleaming with vindication. She had known it, hadn't she? This was her rightful inheritance, a testament to her favored status. She briefly glanced at me, a look of smug superiority passing between us. Maria, in her corner chair, remained an unmoving, silent statue, her gaze fixed on the lawyer, her expression unreadable. And now, Mr. Henderson announced, his voice taking on a slightly different cadence, a subtle shift that caught my attention. We moved to the final, and perhaps most significant, provision of Mr. Thorne's will. Sofia's triumphant posture stiffened. She leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing, a flicker of suspicion returning to her gaze. She was anticipating the crowning jewel, something even grander, I assumed. My own pulse quickened. My father rarely did anything without a flourish, and this slow build-up felt like the crescendo to one of his more elaborate schemes. I could feel the energy in the room condense, the air growing colder, heavier. This was the moment everything would truly change. To Maria Elena Rodriguez, Mr. Henderson read, his voice clear and resonant, and for the first time Maria flinched, a slight tremor passing through her clasped hands. For her unwavering loyalty, tireless dedication, and most importantly, for being the truest friend and companion I have ever known, I bequeath my primary residence, the penthouse apartment at 270 Park Avenue, including all its furnishings and contents, free and clear of all encumbrances. The estimated market value of this property is $2 million. The words hung in the air, a stunning, brutal declaration. I saw Maria's eyes widen, her breath catching in her throat, a hand instinctively rising to cover her mouth. The apartment, our father's sanctuary, his prized possession, the very symbol of his success, the one Sofia had always coveted, the one she believed was undeniably hers. The shock was absolute, the silence that followed deafening, broken only by the sharp, desperate gasp that tore from Sofia's lips. Sofia's gasp turned into a choked, guttural sound, like an animal caught in a trap. Her face, which moments ago had been flushed with triumph, now drained of all color, leaving her features stark and contorted with disbelief. The penthouse? My father's penthouse? To her? The words were barely a whisper, yet they vibrated with an intensity that made the air itself tremble. She pointed a trembling finger at Maria, whose hands were still pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide, staring at Mr. Henderson as if he had conjured the words out of thin air. This is an outrage, a travesty. It must be a mistake, a cruel joke. Her voice finally broke free, rising to a near scream that echoed off the quiet office walls. Mr. Henderson, unperturbed, simply steepled his fingers. There is no mistake, Sofia. The will is meticulously drafted and witnessed. Mr. Marcus Thorne was of sound mind at the time of its execution. His calm, almost robotic delivery only seemed to fuel Sofia's rage. She sprang from her chair, her silk dress rustling aggressively. Sound mind? He must have been senile. Or she manipulated him. Yes, that's it. She preyed on an old man, tricked him into signing away my birthright. Her eyes darted wildly, seeking confirmation from me, then settling on Maria with a venomous glare. You gold digger, you snake, how could you? My own mind was a whirlwind. The penthouse. That wasn't just any property. It was Dad's most cherished possession, the one he'd bought right after his first big success. the one with the panoramic views of Central Park he loved so much. He always told us stories about how he'd walk through those empty rooms, dreaming of the empire he would build. Sofia had always assumed it was hers, the ultimate symbol of her place in his affections. To see it go to Maria, our silent, unassuming housekeeper, felt like a deliberate, almost theatrical slap in the face from our deceased father. I felt a strange mix of bewilderment and a flicker of something that might have been admiration for Dad's audacity. Maria, though visibly shaken, slowly lowered her hands. Her gaze, still fixed on the lawyer, now held a deep, unreadable sorrow, but also a quiet resolve. She didn't meet Sofia's furious eyes, almost as if she understood that Sofia's words were born of pain and shock, not directed at her true self. Her silence, however, only seemed to enrage Sofia further. "Don't you dare stand there silently pretending to be innocent. You know exactly what you did. You wormed your way into his affections, you conniving—" "Sofia," I cut in, my voice surprisingly firm, cutting through her tirade. I hadn't meant to speak, but the sheer vitriol in her words was becoming unbearable. "That's enough. This isn't helping anything." My intervention momentarily diverted her fury, her eyes snapping to me, blazing. "Not helping? Pedro, are you blind? Can't you see what this woman has done? She's stolen what was rightfully ours, our father's legacy, his home." Her voice broke, a raw, wounded sound that finally revealed the depth of her shock and hurt beneath the anger. "Mr. Henderson simply watched us, his expression unreadable, waiting for the storm to subside. The air crackled with the aftermath of a bomb that had just exploded, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Sofia's glare, her chest still heaving, pivoted from me to Mr. Henderson. You can't be serious," she managed, her voice dangerously low, a stark contrast to her earlier shriek. It was the desperate sound of someone clinging to the last vestiges of control. "Mr. Henderson, unmoved, allowed her a moment to internalize the futility of her protest. "The provisions are quite clear, Sofia," he reiterated, his tone unwavering. "If you wish to contest the will, you are, of course, within your rights. But that process will occur outside this office, at a later date, and will require substantial grounds." He paused, letting the weight of legalities sink in. She visibly deflated, collapsing back into her chair with a shuddering sigh, her eyes still burning holes in Maria's quiet form. The immediate fire had been doused, but the embers glowed fiercely, promising a continuing inferno beneath the imposed calm. I watched Maria from the corner of my eye. Her head was bowed slightly, her dark hair a curtain around her face. She still hadn't uttered a single word. Was she embarrassed, overwhelmed, or was there a deeper understanding, a quiet recognition of what this gesture truly meant beyond its monetary value? I found myself recalling fleeting images from my childhood. Dad, always so distant with us, sometimes spent long hours in the kitchen with Maria. The scent of her cooking filled the air, their hushed tones carrying through the open door. I remembered seeing her once, wiping away tears in the hallway, and Dad had put a comforting hand on her shoulder, a gesture I rarely, if ever, received. The room, though no longer vibrating with outright anger, was now thick with a heavy, oppressive silence, each second stretching taut with unspoken questions. The silence that followed my intervention was even heavier than the fury preceding it. Sofia sat slumped, her breath still coming in ragged gasps, her eyes fixated on Maria with an intensity that promised a storm yet to break. I, too, found my gaze drawn to Maria, who still hadn't lifted her head completely. Her stillness was profound, almost meditative in stark contrast to the chaos Sofia had unleashed. What was she thinking? What did she feel now that the world she silently inhabited was so violently exposed? A strange, unsettling pity flickered within me, quickly followed by a prickle of shame for Sofia's cruel words. My father, Marcus, had always been a man of grand gestures, but this felt different. Not a public display of power, but a private, deeply personal statement delivered from beyond the grave. It forced me to reevaluate every assumption I'd ever held about him, about us, about Maria. I thought back to those hushed conversations, the comforting hand, the way Maria's face, usually so composed, would soften when she looked at Dad. Were these moments, which I'd dismissed as casual employer-employee interactions, actually threads of a much deeper tapestry? The very air in the office seemed to vibrate with untold stories, with emotions too complex to fit into neat categories. Sofia finally stirred, her voice low and raspy, a dangerous tremor beneath the forced calm. "Mr. Henderson," she began, pushing herself upright, her posture stiff with renewed resolve. "This is simply untenable. My father was a titan of industry. He would never make such an egregious error, not without undue influence. I demand to see the original document, the signatures, everything." Her eyes, though still red-rimmed, now held a sharp, calculating glint. She was moving from raw emotion to strategic attack, a familiar maneuver for her. "I suspect foul play, outright manipulation." She gestured towards Maria with a dismissive flick of her wrist, as if Maria were an invisible, contemptible stain. Mr. Henderson maintained his unshakable composure. "As I stated, Sofia, the will is legally sound. All documents, including witnessed signatures, are filed with the courts and are available for review through proper legal channels, should you choose to contest. However, the reading of the will itself is concluded." He closed the large leather binder with a decisive thud, the sound echoing ominously in the room. This simple action seemed to signal an end to the formal proceedings, yet it felt like the beginning of something far more tumultuous. Sofia's face hardened, her jaw clenching, the reality of her powerlessness beginning to sink in. A memory surfaced, unbidden, from my teenage years. I was home from boarding school, sick with a nasty fever. Dad was, as usual, consumed by work. But Maria, instead of her usual duties, had brought me bowls of her homemade chicken soup, her cool hand gently pressing against my forehead. She sat by my bed for hours, telling me quiet stories of her childhood in a small village, stories I'd never heard from anyone else. And then Dad had come in, briefly, not to check on me, but to ask Maria if she had eaten, a genuine concern in his voice I rarely heard directed at me or Sofia. I remembered the warmth in his eyes as he looked at her, a fleeting, almost imperceptible softening. That moment, so insignificant at the time, now burned bright with a new, searing clarity. It wasn't just concern for an employee. It was something else, something deeper, more tender. He had always been so stoic, so guarded with us, his children. Yet with Maria, there had been a different kind of ease, a quiet understanding that bypassed words. I looked at Maria again, her hands now resting calmly in her lap, her eyes still cast down. She was a silent keeper of secrets, a quiet observer of our lives, and, it now seemed, a profound and unexpected recipient of my father's most intimate trust. The sheer weight of that realization pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. Sofia pushed her chair back, the harsh scrape on the floor jarring. "This is not over, Mr. Henderson. Not by a long shot. This is an insult to my father's memory and to our family." Her voice, though still controlled, vibrated with a barely suppressed fury. She stood, pulling her purse over her shoulder with an aggressive snap, her eyes blazing a final venomous glance at Maria before sweeping out of the room without another word. The door slammed shut behind her, a punctuation mark on the raw, open wound of our fractured family. Her exit left a gaping void, yet the true tension remained, centered on the two of us left, and the silent, unassuming woman still seated in the corner. The reverberations of Sofia's departure left a hollow echo in the suddenly expansive room. The air vibrated with the sudden absence of Sofia's fury, leaving behind a vacuum filled only by the rhythmic tick of an old grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I felt a strange sense of liberation, yet also a heavy, unsettling weight settling on my chest. Sofia's rage, though exhausting, had at least been a familiar element in our family drama. Now, with her gone, the true, naked revelation of my father's final act lay exposed, demanding silent contemplation. Mr. Henderson finally looked up, his gaze moving from the now closed door to Maria, then to me. His face remained a professional mask, but a flicker of something, perhaps a tired understanding, briefly crossed his eyes. "Maria," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the lawyerly pronouncements. "I can arrange for a representative to walk you through the transfer of ownership at your convenience. There will be some paperwork, of course." Maria finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his, then briefly mine. Her eyes were not triumphant nor vengeful, but filled with a profound, almost bewildered sadness. It was a look that spoke volumes, hinting at a burden rather than a windfall. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice a whisper, barely audible, a soft, melodic accent I hadn't truly noticed in years. It was the first time I'd heard her speak more than a few functional words in recent memory. I found myself wanting to ask her something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. What could I ask? "Were you in love with my father? Was he in love with you?" The questions felt too raw, too intrusive, too disrespectful to the quiet dignity she held. The apartment, the symbol of my father's success and Sofia's perceived birthright, now belonged to this unassuming woman who had cleaned our toilets and cooked our meals. It was a truth so outlandish, so entirely unexpected, that it completely rewrote the narrative of my entire life, forcing me to question every memory, every assumption about my family. A particularly vivid memory flashed through my mind: my 16th birthday. Dad had forgotten it, or rather, he hadn't. He'd sent a lavish gift through his assistant, a new expensive watch. But Maria had appeared at my bedroom door later that evening with a small, homemade cake, lit by a single candle. "Happy birthday, Pedro," she had whispered, her smile gentle. "Your father, he is a busy man, but he cares. I know he does." It wasn't just the cake. It was the warmth, the personal touch that my father, in his grandiosity, had completely overlooked. Maria had filled the gaps, not just in our household, but in our emotional lives, silently, humbly. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant city hum filtering through the thick office windows. Mr. Henderson gathered his papers, his movements precise and efficient. He seemed to sense the unspoken weight in the room, offering no platitudes, no explanations. He simply nodded, first to Maria, then to me. "I believe that concludes our formal proceedings for today. My office will be in touch with both of you regarding further details." His tone, though still professional, held a note of finality, as if closing a complex chapter. I watched Maria slowly rise from her chair, her movements unhurried, almost hesitant. She didn't meet my gaze directly, instead keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, as if navigating a treacherous path. The weight of the will, the apartment, the untold story, hung between us like an invisible shroud. I suddenly understood my father's audacity. This wasn't just about money or property. It was a testament, a final declaration of who truly saw him, who truly cared for him beyond the superficial layers of wealth and family obligation. It was a profound, almost devastating act of revelation. I watched Maria, her small frame now seeming to carry an immense weight. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She was a vessel for my father's final, most intimate secret, a living testament to a love or companionship none of us, his children, had ever truly recognized. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken questions. I felt an impulse to reach out, to ask, to understand, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate. My gaze lingered on her, trying to decipher the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her fingers still subtly trembled, even as she composed herself. It was clear this was as much a shock, perhaps even a burden, for her as it was a revelation for us. "Maria," I finally managed, my voice sounding rough, unfamiliar even to my own ears. She flinched slightly, her eyes dark and deep, finally meeting mine. There was no defiance, no gloating, only a profound weariness, an almost mournful expression. Did you know?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. It wasn't about the apartment itself, but about the decades of untold stories, the unspoken connection that had existed under our very noses. I felt a surge of something akin to shame for our collective blindness, our self-absorption. She shook her head slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. "No, Pedro, I never imagined this. Her voice was soft, laced with that gentle accent, a sound that suddenly brought back a flood of childhood memories. Her humming as she cooked, her soft footsteps on the stairs, the low murmur of her voice comforting me after a nightmare. She paused, then continued, her gaze dropping to her clasped hands. Your father, he was a good man to me. Always respectful, always kind. But this is too much. A tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to a complex tapestry of emotions I could only begin to guess at. Too much? I echoed, genuinely puzzled. For Sofia, it was too little, a slight. For Maria, this incredible gift was too much. The contrast was stark, illuminating the vast chasm between their perspectives and perhaps their souls. The apartment. It's worth millions, I added, stating the obvious, but needing to hear it confirmed, to grasp the sheer scale of my father's decision. I couldn't reconcile the image of our aloof, driven father with this incredibly generous, almost vulnerable act of giving. It was as if he had revealed a part of himself he had kept hidden from the world, and most painfully, from us. Maria finally looked up again, her eyes glistening. He always said it was a place where he found peace, Pedro. A place where he could just be himself. He told me once, many years ago, that it reminded him of his mother's house, even though they were so different. He said it was the only place he ever truly felt at home, truly safe. He didn't want it to become just another asset, another thing to be traded or sold. Her words painted a picture of my father I had never known, a man who sought solace and genuine connection, not just power and profit. This revelation was even more shocking than the will itself. So he gave it to someone he trusted to cherish it, not exploit it, I murmured, more to myself than to her. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a painful, beautiful mosaic. My father, Marcus Thorne, the titan of industry, was also a man who craved simple human warmth, a quiet understanding that Sofia and I, caught in our own worlds of expectation and entitlement, had failed to provide. Maria, the silent shadow in our grand house, had been the one to see him, to hear him, to offer him that refuge. My throat tightened with a strange mix of regret and a burgeoning, unexpected respect for both of them. She nodded, a wistful smile gracing her lips, fleeting and fragile. He would often talk to me late at night when everyone else was asleep, about his worries, his dreams, even his regrets. He said I was the only one who listened without judgment. He called me his silent confidant. The phrase silent confidant resonated deep within me, echoing the profound trust my father had placed in her. It wasn't a romantic love, not in the way Sofia would undoubtedly twist it, but a bond of profound, unadorned human connection, forged in the quiet corners of a bustling, lonely life. It was a truth that cut deeper than any inheritance. The apartment, his sanctuary, the symbol of an empire, entrusted to Maria. The words Maria had spoken, about my father finding peace there, about it reminding him of his mother's house, twisted in my gut. It wasn't just a physical space, it was a deeply personal vault of his true self, a self I had never been privy to. I had always seen Marcus Thorne, the businessman, the distant patriarch, the man who provided but rarely truly connected. But Maria had known Marcus, the man who sought solace, who craved warmth, who confided his fears in a housekeeper rather than his own children. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow, yet there was a strange, undeniable beauty in it too, a testament to a connection forged in sincerity rather than blood or expectation. My vision blurred for a moment and I swallowed, a lump forming in my throat. All those years, all those fleeting glimpses of interaction, now coalesced into a coherent, startling narrative. The way he'd ask her about her day, a casualness he rarely extended to me or Sofia. The soft, almost imperceptible way his shoulders would relax when she brought him his coffee. Not the expensive blend he preferred, but a simple, strong brew she knew he truly loved, one he'd never ask for in front of us. He had allowed himself to be vulnerable with her, to be seen not as a titan, but as a tired man yearning for understanding. It was a revelation that stripped away decades of assumptions, leaving me feeling exposed and foolish. Maria's presence in the room, her quiet dignity, now felt less like an anomaly and more like a profound truth. She had watched us grow up. She had nursed me through fevers. She had silently witnessed the chasm that grew between my father and his children. What must she have thought, seeing our grand, emotionally starved lives unfold from her vantage point? I imagined her in the kitchen, preparing our elaborate meals, hearing our arguments, seeing our father retreat into his work, only to find solace in the quiet comfort of her presence. It was a narrative far more complex, and frankly, far more human, than anything Sofia or I had ever conceived. "He truly found peace with you, didn't he?" I asked, the question barely a whisper, my voice thick with a mix of awe and regret. It wasn't accusatory, but born of a desperate need to understand the depths of this relationship. Maria looked up, her eyes still holding that deep, unreadable sorrow. She nodded slowly, her lips pressed together, as if the memories were too tender, too sacred to articulate fully. "He was a very lonely man, Pedro," she finally said, her voice soft. "Despite all he had, he carried many burdens that he could not share with everyone." Her gaze briefly flickered to the closed door where Sofia had exited, a silent acknowledgement of our family's failures. Her words resonated, striking a chord deep within me. Lonely. Yes, that was it. My father, in all his grandeur, had been profoundly lonely. And Maria, the unassuming housekeeper, had been the one to fill that void, not with grand gestures or lavish gifts, but with quiet companionship, with presence, with genuine, unburdened listening. This wasn't about a love affair, not in the carnal sense Sofia would imply, but about something far more enduring and rare. Pure, unconditional human connection. It was a mirror held up to my own life, revealing the superficiality of my own relationship with my father. "And you offered him that," I mused, the realization washing over me like a cold wave. "You gave him what we couldn't or wouldn't." The admission felt raw, painful, yet utterly true. It was a confession of my own failings, of Sofia's entitlement, of our collective blindness to the man beneath the mogul. We had been too busy chasing his approval, his money, his legacy, to truly see him, to truly offer him comfort without agenda. Maria, however, had simply been there, a constant, unwavering presence in a world of flux and demanding expectations. She offered a faint, sad smile. "I only did what I believed was right, Pedro. To listen, to care." He was a good man to me, as I said. Her humility was startling, a stark contrast to the greed and fury that had just filled the room. She was not gloating, not triumphant. She was simply stating a truth that had always existed, unseen, unheard, by those closest to my father. This wasn't a victory for her. It was the quiet unfolding of a profound secret trust. I felt a strange sense of shame, not for her, but for myself, for Sofia, for the entire opulent facade of our family. My father's legacy wasn't just in the buildings he erected or the fortunes he amassed. It was in this final, audacious act of bequeathing his most cherished possession to the one person who had truly offered him solace. It was a final lesson from a complex man, delivered from beyond the grave, teaching me about the true currency of life. Not wealth, but connection, trust, and the quiet dignity of a listening heart. My gaze lingered on Maria, a silent acknowledgement of the immeasurable gift she had given my father, and the profound, humbling truth she had now, inadvertently, given me. The air around us seemed to thin, making every breath a conscious effort. Maria's quiet pronouncements, delivered with such humble sincerity, had not merely revealed a clause in a will. They had unearthed a subterranean river of my father's life, a current of emotion and connection that ran deeper and purer than anything Sofia or I had ever known. It was as if a hidden door had swung open in the grand edifice of Marcus Thorne, revealing a solitary chamber where his true heart resided, tended to not by his children, but by the unassuming woman who now stood before me. I felt a profound shift within myself, a recalibration of what truly held value, a painful understanding that the most precious things often exist in the quietest spaces. My father, the Titan, the symbol of aspiration, had found his most significant solace not in his empire, but in the simple, unwavering presence of another human being. I finally managed to stand, my legs feeling heavy, as if gravity itself had increased its pull. Maria, her eyes still holding that deep well of sorrow, offered me a small, almost apologetic smile. "I should go, Pedro," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the silence. "There is much to process." Her words were simple, yet they carried the immense weight of the truth that had just fractured our comfortable illusions. She didn't gloat, she didn't express triumph. She seemed burdened, almost haunted by the enormity of the gift and the silent story it carried. It struck me then, with piercing clarity, that this was not a victory for her, but a final poignant act of service, accepting a sacred trust from a man she had deeply respected and perhaps truly loved in a way neither Sofia nor I could comprehend. "Maria," I said again, the single word an inadequate vessel for the storm of emotions swirling within me. "Thank you." It wasn't just for the chicken soup of my childhood, or the birthday cake, or even for being the quiet, steady presence our father had so desperately needed. It was a thank you for revealing a side of him I never knew existed, for holding the secret of his vulnerability, for showing me that true wealth lay not in what we accumulated, but in the genuine, unburdened connections we forged. She simply nodded, a slight inclination of her head, and turned to leave, her footsteps barely audible on the plush carpet. Her departure felt less like an exit and more like a gentle fading, a whisper disappearing into the vastness of the world. I watched her walk out, her small frame dissolving into the hallway, leaving me alone in the lawyer's office, surrounded by the ghosts of expectation and the raw, undeniable truth. The heavy oak door swung shut with a soft click, a sound that seemed to seal off the past, leaving only the reverberations of what had just been revealed. Mr. Henderson, ever the professional, merely cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the now empty space where Maria had sat, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet dignity that had just departed. The will, now a crumpled piece of paper in my hand, felt less like a document of inheritance and more like a riddle, finally solved, albeit with profound and humbling implications. The apartment, Sofia's coveted prize, now stood not as a monument to my father's success, but as a testament to his deepest human needs. It was a silent witness to moments of vulnerability, solace, and perhaps a love that transcended conventional labels. He hadn't given it to Maria out of manipulation or senility, but out of a profound understanding of who she truly was to him, his sanctuary, his confidant, the one person who saw past the empire to the man within. And in that moment, a strange peace settled over me, a melancholic acceptance of a truth that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The afternoon light, once sharp and unforgiving, softened, painting the room in hues of fading gold. I realized that my father, in his final act, had not only redistributed his material wealth, but had also bequeathed a far greater, intangible inheritance, a lesson in what truly matters. He had forced us to look beyond the surface, beyond the glint of gold and the sheen of success, to the quiet, enduring power of human connection. It was a legacy far more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more profoundly human than any of us had ever anticipated. As I finally rose to leave the office, the leather of the chair cool beneath my fingers, I felt the phantom weight of those 20 years Maria had spent in our home. 20 years of silent observation, of unwavering service, of a quiet, unheralded presence that had been the anchor in my father's often turbulent life. The grandeur of the city outside, visible through the large window, now seemed less significant, less compelling. What truly resonated was the image of Maria, her hands clasped, her eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding, a quiet dignity that eclipsed all the bluster and ambition of the world. The city hummed beyond the glass, an indifferent symphony to the private earthquake that had just occurred within these walls. I thought of my father, Marcus, not as the formidable CEO, but as the lonely man seeking comfort, finding it in the most unexpected of places. And I thought of Maria, not as the housekeeper, but as the quiet architect of his peace, the true guardian of his spirit. Their story, woven in the unspoken tapestry of their shared lives, was now laid bare, a testament to the profound, often invisible connections that shape us all. It was a whisper from the grave, a universal insight echoing into the silence, that sometimes the greatest treasures are not inherited, but simply seen and profoundly, tenderly given.